In this video, I'll present information from Chapter 12 of Human Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition. This chapter focuses on the central nervous system. In particular, we'll be looking at the spinal cord in this video. Spinal cord has two major functions. One is to provide two-way communication to and from the brain. Additionally, the spinal cord contains spinal reflex centers. These are centers that can work without input from the brain. The simplest example would be something like a simple reflex, like when a doctor hits your knee with a hammer. That patellar reflex is something that a signal travels to the spinal cord, and then a response is immediately sent back to the muscle controlling the knee, causing your leg to kick. This doesn't necessarily involve the brain at all. It can work only with the spinal cord using these spinal reflex centers. So those are the two main functions of the spinal cord. Protection of the spinal cord looks a lot like protection of the brain because it's mainly continuations of the same types of protective structures, such as bone. So instead of the cranium, we have the vertebrae. The meninges are actually the same and are continuous with the meninges you see coating the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid, again, it's continuous with what you're seeing in the brain, still flowing through that subarachnoid space. But there is one additional protective measure that is special to the spinal cord. And you can see here in this illustration this additional measure, which is this layer of fat, this fatty tissue called the epidural space. So this is a space in between the dura mater and the vertebrae. And it's, again, filled with a cushion of fat and veins. And so this would be where things like when you hear of someone getting an epidural to numb, say, the lower half of the body during childbirth, for instance, that is being injected into this epidural space. So it's another protective mechanism, this fatty pad, to protect the spinal cord. There are a couple of different features of the spinal cord that we'd like you to be aware of for this class. One of them would be the cervical and lumbar enlargements. So you can see here's the cervical enlargement up above. It's just it looks small, but it's a bulging of the spinal cord at this area. Same thing with the lumbar enlargement. You can see it's a skinny little spinal cord there, and then it becomes a little bit bulged out at the lumbar enlargement. The important point about these enlargements, however, is that this is where the spinal nerves are coming off of the spinal cord and serving the upper and lower limbs. So this is where the upper and lower limbs are connecting to the spinal cord. Another interesting structure in the spinal cord is actually these nerve roots that are hanging down from the bottom of the spinal cord. So while we have vertebrae that run all the way from the skull down to the coccyx at the bottom, actually the spinal cord ends before it reaches that coccyx area. Instead, it's ending here in the lumbar area, and from there on out, it's just loose nerve roots that are hanging down, and they're called the cauda equina. And I think they're called that because if you use your imagination, it looks somewhat like a horse's mane hanging down from the bottom of the spinal cord proper. An incredibly important feature of the spinal cord is that it is the source, or it is the meeting point of the central nervous system with the spinal nerves. So those spinal nerves, just like the cranial nerves, are part of the peripheral nervous system. But these, instead of meeting the central nervous system at the brain, spinal nerves meet the central nervous system somewhere along the spinal cord. There are actually 31 pairs of spinal nerves. There are a lot of spinal nerves. Remember, there were only 12 cranial nerves, so 31 pairs of spinal nerves. You can see that they're branching off from both the dorsal and the ventral side of the spinal cord. They meet up and then they form a spinal nerve that is then going to split again later on and travel to different parts of the body. But these spinal nerves are, again, regularly emerging from the spinal cord, and there are 31 pairs. If we look within the spinal cord, we're going to see very distinctive distribution of tissues. So just like in the brain, the gray matter is where you're going to find a higher density of cell bodies, and the white matter is where you'll find a high density of myelinated axons. In this case, we can break up the gray matter into 3 different sections. So it's actually easy to see here as well. So here we have the posterior horn. So there's one on each side. The posterior horn is the gray matter in the posterior of the spinal cord. And the anterior horn is going to be the gray matter on the anterior of the spinal cord. Here, I can show you that with this different picture. So again, here's the posterior or dorsal horn. Here is the anterior or ventral horn. The reason I'm bringing this up so much is because they are associated with different functions. So if we're looking at the posterior or dorsal horn, that's actually receiving sensory input. So when input is coming from the periphery into the spinal cord, it's going to enter through the dorsal horn. On the other hand, the anterior or ventral horns, that's where motor activity will be found. So in this case, you'll see it packed with big motor neurons. And those motor neurons are then sending projections out to the periphery. So you can see here there's a flow, an information flow. So information comes in through the dorsal horns and leaves through the ventral horns. Additionally, in some regions of the spinal cord, particularly in the thoracic region, we're going to see a whole nother horn, which will be a little bulge on the side of this gray matter. So the lateral horns will be important for sympathetic neurons. So sympathetic neurons, I'll remind you, are neurons that are helping to prepare your body for activity. So things like increasing your heart rate, for instance. And then finally, if we look in here, we're going to see the dorsal root ganglia. It turns out that while those motor neurons are present within the ventral horn, for sensory neurons, we're going to find their cell bodies out here outside in the periphery. So the sensory nerve bodies are present, or they're concentrated in these dorsal root ganglia. So in addition to that gray matter, there's also a lot of white matter. In fact, most of the spinal cord is made up of this white matter. So this is myelinated, mainly myelinated axons traveling up and down the spinal cord. It can be divided into 3 segments. So if you look here at the gray matter, you'll see that it's basically like 4 cups that have been formed. So this cup at the top, this is going to be called the dorsal or posterior funiculus. So that's the column of white matter on the posterior of the spinal cord. We have the ventral funiculus, so that's on this cup here, this area. And then we also have 2 lateral funiculi, so one on the left, one on the right. These are important because these are representative of nerve fiber tracts. So each of these little red circles is a descending tract. That means that it is axons that are descending from the brain to the spinal cord or even to lower levels, so motor outputs. In blue, we see other spinal tracts, and these are ascending, so they're traveling from the periphery up to the brain. And then finally, there's also communication between the 2 sides of the brain. This is transverse communication. This could be used for instance, for some types of reflexes. For instance, if you were to step on a tack, in addition to having the foot that's stepping on the tack retract, you're going to want to tense up your standing leg so that you don't topple over. Those things need to happen together. They need to be coordinated. And this is an example where we're going to see this transverse signaling from one side of the spinal cord to the other. Unfortunately, the spinal cord can be fairly easily injured. This is a spinal cord injury, and in many cases this is a transection. A transection is some sort of cut, so a cross-sectioning across the spinal cord at any level. One thing important to note is that all levels below the level of injury will be cut off from the brain. That means, for instance, if the injury happens down here in the thoracic or lumbar regions, then anything below that, so mainly you'll see the lower half of the body, like the lower limbs, will be cut off from the brain. This means you're unable to now perceive any stimuli to those lower limbs, and you may be unable to move the lower limbs. So this is known as paraplegia. On the other hand, if the injury occurs all the way at the top in the cervical section, this means now that everything below that section is no longer able to communicate with the brain. If it's high enough in the cervical region, that could include the nerves that are controlling your diaphragm, so that's inhalation, so you may no longer be able to inhale. It's controlling your upper limbs, your lower limbs, your abdomen, basically everything in your body except for maybe your shoulders, neck, and head. And this would be known as quadriplegia. So this is a loss of movement in both lower and upper limbs. So as stated here, the summary would be that the higher up a spinal transection occurs, the more severe the results will be. So I'll just leave you with this question at the end of this video on the spinal cord.